Now we have Professor Wiliam as a plenary speaker. He's an Emeritus Professor of Educational Assessment at the UCL Institute of Education. After a first degree in mathematics and physics, he taught in inner city schools in London for 7 years. In 1984, he joined Chelsea College, University of London, which later merged with King's College London. He worked as a dean and principal there. In 2003, he moved to the USA as Senior Research Director at the Educational Testing Services in Princeton. From 2006 to 10, he was Deputy Director of the Institute of Education, University of London. In 2010, he left university life in order to concentrate on teaching and research, and his work focuses on the use of assessment to support learning. He now works with the groups of teachers all over the world on developing formative assessment practices. Today, his topic of speech is the bridge between teaching and learning. So please, Professor Wiliam.
Thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. In my work with educators around the world over the last 30 years, I have become convinced that there is one idea that is more important than every other idea. And that is the idea of opportunity cost. The idea that every hour that teachers and students spend on one thing is an hour they don't have to spend on something else. And that's why I think what works in education is not the most important question, because everything works somewhere, nothing works everywhere. The question is, under what circumstances does it work and how well does it work? So we need to focus our efforts. And I think the following 5 questions are a good starting point for when research can actually help us become better teachers. The first is, does it solve a problem we have? The research might show that if something is improved, then students learn more. But if we've already made that improvement, that's not going to help us. The second question is, if we do this, how much faster will our students learn? I think it's really important to bear in mind that in education, this is very difficult to determine. People talk about effect sizes in education, but an effect size doesn't tell you how much extra learning is going to take place if you do this thing. So with the question we should be asking our researchers is how much faster? What's the percentage increase in the rate of learning if we do this? And they say this is very difficult. To which you should say, yes, but it's the only thing that matters. Because any improvement in education involves an improvement in the rate, in the speed at which students learn something. And if they don't know how much of an improvement, then you can't make smart decisions about whether this is worth your time. And this is the third question, what will be the cost in money? Sure, but more importantly, in terms of teacher time, because of this issue of opportunity cost. The fourth issue is, can we implement it here? So you generally find that if you can afford it, smaller groups for each teacher lead to better learning if the teachers are equally good. But the trouble is, if teacher recruitment is challenging, then reducing class size means you have to hire people who aren't as good as the people you've got. And in some cases, it's been discovered that reducing class size actually makes things worse because you're giving jobs to people who wouldn't normally be getting jobs because you need more teachers for the smaller classes. So this suggests to me that every educator, every teacher, every leader needs to be a critical consumer of educational research, asking these questions. Can we implement it here? What will be the cost? How much extra progress will our students make? And is it something we need to solve? Right now, I think there are currently 2 best bets. The first is curriculum development. There is no doubt that with more effective curricula, students make more progress. But unfortunately, we're not able to predict in advance which curricula are more important. We can do studies that show that some curricula are more effective than others, but right now, we don't know how to guarantee this. And that's why the 5th question, do we know what to do? And when we do that, we find that by quite some margin, the single most important thing that we can do to improve students' learning is what I call formative assessment. This idea of using assessment to figure out what our students have learned and make adjustments to our teaching accordingly. You can make an empirical case or an intuitive case. The intuitive case is very simple. It comes from a principle about learning and an uncomfortable fact about the world. The principle comes from the work of David Azubel, who pointed out over 50 years ago, if I had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, I would say this. The most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach accordingly. Why is it so hard? Because of the uncomfortable fact about the world. Our students do not always, even often, certainly not necessarily, they do not learn what we teach. And this is why assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. It is only through assessment that we can figure out whether what we just did as teachers will result in the learning that we actually want. Now, before I go any further, I want to clarify what I mean by learning. I think the best definition I've come across is from Paul Kirshner and his colleagues. Learning is a change in long-term memory. And many people dislike that definition. They say it's more than memorization. Of course it is. But what Kirshner and his colleagues are pointing out here is if students can do something at the end of today's lesson, today's lecture, today's session, but they can't do it in 2 weeks' time, we should not call that learning. The idea of learning is we produce long-term changes in our students. Now, the fact that students can do something at the end of today's lesson does not mean they can do it in 6 weeks' time, because learning is a long-term change in capability. But, and this is the foundational idea, if they cannot do something right now, it's highly unlikely they will be able to do it in 6 weeks' time. The big idea here is that as a teacher, you will make better decisions about what to do next if you have better information about what's going on in students' heads. And by better, I mean better in 2 ways. The first is better as deeper. So for example, a science teacher might ask, would your weight be the same on the moon? And most students get that right because they've seen videos of astronauts bouncing around the moon's surface. A better question to ask is, would your mass be the same on the moon? Because many students think the answer to that is no, and that's incorrect. So it's asking questions that give us insight into students' learning, better questioning as deeper, but also as broader, getting information from all of the students in the group rather than just the confident, articulate ones. And that's the key to what I call classroom formative assessment. Better evidence leads to better decisions, leads to better learning. It's as simple as that. Now, the way to think about it is building plan B into plan A. There's a strange paradox at the heart of teaching. Every teacher I've ever met knows that no plan survives their first contact with actual students. And yet most teachers plan their lectures, their sessions, as if they're going to go perfectly. What I'm suggesting is we should build plan B into plan A, build checkpoints into our lessons. And at a certain point, we stop and we find out if the students are with us. And if they are, we move on. And if they're not, we do something about it. The important point is that is planned as part of the lecture or the session or the lesson, rather than having the teacher having to figure out what to do when they suddenly discover things aren't going according to plan. The empirical case, the research, these 18 studies here synthesize about 5,000 research reports on the impacts of feedback and other aspects of classroom formative assessment on student achievement. The trouble is that there's no agreed definition of formative assessment. So in order to be inclusive, I suggest we talk about long cycle, medium cycle, and short cycle formative assessment. They're all formative, but they differ in the span, the length, and what gets formed by the formative assessment. So if we give students a formative assessment task every 6 to 10 weeks, for example, that can monitor student achievement, it can help us align our curriculum. We can also do things on a shorter time scale by making sure the students understand what they need to do to succeed on a unit or a project. Typical cycle length of 1 to 4 weeks, and the result of that is what Richard Stiggins calls student-involved assessment. Assessment that becomes something done with students rather than to them. But the biggest impact, what the research shows, is the greatest impact on student progress comes when we do it minute by minute and day by day. So not every 6 to 10 weeks, but more likely every 6 to 10 minutes. And here's an example from a primary school, elementary school. A teacher is introducing students to how to write a grammatically correct sentence. She's asking the class, is the sentence she's just written on the interactive whiteboard correct? There's one boy turning to look at me, a couple of boys thinking that the answer is correct. They're holding up green discs. But most of the children think there's a mistake there. They're signaling either orange or red. The teacher says, okay, what's wrong with it? Tell me what's wrong with it. We'll fix it. We'll vote again. And this, I think, encapsulates the essence of effective classroom formative assessment. It's a pedagogy of engagement. The teacher is getting evidence from every student rather than just the confident ones. And she's using that to adjust her teaching to better meet student learning needs. So that is the most powerful form of formative assessment, a pedagogy of engagement and a pedagogy of responsiveness. Now, to actually put this into practice, we need to actually dig down a bit deeper. And the framework that I have found most helpful for thinking about this is to think about 3 processes in education: where the learner is going, where the learner is right now, how to get there, and think about the role of the teacher, the learner themselves, and their peers. And that gives us 9 cells. And we could discuss each of these separately, but I think the most effective way of grouping these together is to think about the following ways of organizing these ideas. The first is clarifying, sharing, and understanding learning intentions. And in many countries, this has become a bit of a kind of stereotypical, stale exercise of a teacher writing a learning objective on the board, the students copying it into their work and then ignoring it for the rest of the lesson. There is no evidence that I know of that writing learning objectives on the board actually improves things. In fact, there's recent research showing that, in fact, giving students a practice test about what they're going to be learning may be more effective. But here's the most important point. The teacher needs to be clear about where the lesson is going. I don't want teachers walking into a lecture room and saying, oh, look, some students, what shall I do with them? The teacher needs to be clear about what it is the students will learn as a result of being in that session. But whether you share that with the students, and if so, at what point, is a professional judgment best left to the teacher. So sometimes you might start with a learning intention. Sometimes you might ask a question. I saw a great example in a secondary school science classroom. The teacher began the lesson by asking, why does it take longer to cook potatoes at 220 degrees Celsius in an oven than it does at 100 degrees Celsius in a pan of boiling water? Now, the important point is that teacher had a clear learning intention in mind, but she judged that the best way to start the lesson was by getting the students to think about the content she was going to teach. The second strategy we call eliciting evidence of learning. And the reason we frame it like that is because it's not just questioning. It's all the ways we find out where students are in their learning. So you might actually find out where they are by observing. Another point that's really often neglected is that if you want to sustain a conversation with students, it can be more productive to make statements rather than asking questions. So if you ask the students, what do Democrats believe in the United States political system? Student says, Democrats believe in progressive taxation. You might say, but most Republicans also believe in progressive taxation. You're making a declarative statement. If you ask the students about the periodic table and the student says, lithium, sodium, and potassium all have a single electron in the outer shell, you might say, so you're saying that the first 3 elements in group 1 all have a single electron in the outer shell. Why is it so valuable? Because when you make a statement rather than asking a question, students give longer and more thoughtful responses. We don't know why this is, but here's my hunch. You can be wrong answering a question. You can't be wrong responding to a statement. And the really important point is, as teachers, we can't do our job without evidence from our students about what's going on in their heads. And if we create an atmosphere in our classrooms, in our lecture theatres, where the students don't want to share their thinking with us, that's not their problem, that's our problem, because we can't do the job without evidence. The third strategy we call providing feedback that moves learners forward. And the reason we frame it like that is because when we think about the word feedback, people often fixate on the last 4 letters, B-A-C-K. People think that feedback should be backward-looking. In fact, feedback should be forward-looking. It's the view through the windshield, not the view through the rearview mirror. Or as Douglas Reeves points out, it's like the difference between getting a medical and a post-mortem. And too many students get post-mortems. There's a big debate about whether we should give comments or grades, but comments aren't much use if they're actually along the lines of, this would have been a better piece of work had you done the following things, but you didn't, so it isn't. And here's where we go wrong with feedback. We tend to think of the purpose of feedback as improving the work. It is not. The main purpose of feedback is to improve the learner. Good feedback helps the learner take responsibility for their own learning. The last two strategies underscore the fact that, as Richard Stickers has pointed out, the most important decisions taken in classrooms, in lecture theatres, are not taken by teachers, they're taken by learners. That's why we have to activate students as learning resources for one another and as owners of their own learning. And this last strategy, I think, is the most important. It's where the others lead. Let me illustrate. I'm often asked to watch teachers teach a lesson. And if I watch a teacher teach a lesson, I can guarantee that the first question that teacher will ask me at the end of the session is, how did I do? To which I now say, how do you think you did? And I'm doing that because if that teacher can give me a good answer, my work here is done. That teacher knows what she needs to do to get better. She is well on the way to becoming, in the psychological jargon, a self-regulating learner. And this is the really important point about all these strategies. They ultimately put the learner in charge of their own learning. So, for example, good feedback works towards its own redundancy. Good feedback equips the learners with the skills that they need to manage their own learning more effectively. There'll always be a role for external feedback, but if we think about the purpose of feedback as being equipping the learners with the skills they need to manage their own learning, we'll generally get it right more often than not. So some practical techniques here. Rather than giving students a scoring rubric, give them some examples of work at different levels and get them to think about which ones are the better ones. For eliciting evidence, all student response systems, very simple ones like I showed you with the red and green discs. In a lecture theatre, you can buy these so-called classroom clickers, but I prefer finger voting, one for A, two for B. Why? The people who sell these voting systems say you can record every single student response. That does not sound like a plus to me. The idea that every single incorrect answer I have ever given in a classroom is recorded in an Excel spreadsheet until the end of time sounds to me like George Orwell's 1984 has finally arrived. If we want to make our classrooms places where students feel okay about making mistakes, the last thing we should do is record every single one of them. That's why I like mini whiteboards with small groups, finger voting with large groups. I've used it with sessions with over 1,000 students, and it works very well because you can scan the whole group to see whether they understand it, whether it might be productive to ask them to talk to a neighbor, or whether you actually just need to teach it again. Feedback that moves learners forward, a nice technique I saw in a secondary school, writing comments on strips of paper. Each group of 4 students gets back their 4 pieces of writing, and the 4 strips of paper, their task is match the comments to the essays. When students are working towards a big exam or a test, they should do practice tests, absolutely. But rather than having the teacher grade them, what you can do the next day is each group of 4 students gets back their 4 test papers and a blank test sheet, answer sheet, and then their job is to construct the best composite response. Because there is plenty of research, for example, from Graham Nuttall, that shows that students may well mislead each other. This is really important. Then the teacher has a whole class discussion, a whole group discussion, checking that all the students are on the right track. And finally, students as owners of their own learning. Students often complete portfolios. I think every student should have 2 portfolios. One is the presentation portfolio, the latest and the best. The other is the learning portfolio, which documents the learning journey. The important point here is to show students how much progress they've made. When we use letter grades like A, B, C, D, students who get a C tend to get the same grade or worse as they go through the course. So they're not aware that they're learning anything. And so the really important point is a learning portfolio allows a student to see how much progress they've made, building this idea that effort creates ability. And if we actually build that idea that working hard is the key to success, we will actually be able to make much more progress.